You go into a weekend thinking it's just another weekend. You come out of it thinking, what in heaven's name just happened? Which I guess is part of the program when it comes to terrorism in this world. What happened in Paris this past weekend is unspeakable. I'm not going to pretend that I've got all the words and the language to capture everybody's psychology on this, but we can do our best to talk about it and where we are. And Professor Marc Genest from the U.S. Naval War College is my guest here tonight, and he will join me shortly because I think we need to take some quality time on this. I hope you're having a good Monday evening. Thanks for watching at 7:30 and 11:30 on MyRI TV, and of course now on Fox Providence, where so many of you are following us at midnight. Let us go to our rundown and just check in on a couple of issues. I only have a couple of quick thoughts. You know, it's the local stuff that gets lost when we have these kind of international stories or violence or terrorism stories, but I just want to make a couple of quick notes. The Tiverton casino situation is fascinating. One of the local councilmen, Joe Souza, last week echoed this sentiment.
I just don't want people to get a raw deal. If we're promised $4 million and then we only get $1.2 million, people are going to like, oh, these crooked politicians.
Yeah, so they got a big meeting in Tiverton tonight, and it's buoyed in part by a journal story that printed today where Joe Almond, the town administrator, one of the better government guys I know in Rhode Island, says, hey, listen, don't sweat it. The quality of life in Lincoln is just fine with the expanded casino, even hotel conversations. You know, spend your money wisely. Know that it will be a lessening return on investment as it goes, but take the money and, well, not run, but use it wisely. And so I think the Tiverton folks, probably with that advice from Joe Almond in Lincoln, will be even more bullish on that project this evening. We'll see how it goes. At Brown, there just seems to be this tone going on. There was a headline last week, of course, fresh off the Missouri students who really went at their president and chancellor, right? So, well, listen, you can't get too excited about Brown because they'll protest anything at Brown. You know, so, but then you have this little situation that occurred as well. I guess there was a second story this past weekend where a visiting student reportedly got roughed up by a police officer, and President Paxson just seems to be in this kind of continuous dialogue with the students on campus, writing email, presentations, apologies. We're going to invite her in. It's an interesting time, again, in America with another surge of race conversation, which is constructive. It'll get buried in the headlines, at least this week, after what happened in Paris, no doubt. But it always seems like she's kind of on her heels. Maybe that's how you end up running a major university these days. I don't know. And my last thought here on this Monday evening is the Department of Transportation here in Rhode Island, another headline and another set of hires, 3 more significantly paying positions. Now, I don't get all flustered over the actual dollar amounts, but in government speak, they're fairly substantial. There's a new chief of staff to be hired, there's a new communications director to be hired, and there's a new policy director to be hired at those salary positions. And it just seems to me that when we're in the middle of this roadworks conversation and all of this, you know, a $500 million plan and a $1.1 billion spending finance arrangement to pay for the $500 million plan, that maybe your reorg needs to be a little less hiring profound. Does it make any sense? Or maybe you just need better explanation to the rest of the citizens about what it is that you're trying to accomplish. Because right now, I see nothing but hires going on at the DOT. We don't see much efficiency, and they're looking for a whole boatload of dough. Now, reportedly, they're in the middle of some great reform, but I want to see some evidence of the great reform before we just keep hiring and hiring and hiring. And then, of course, there is Paris, and what happened there is just absolutely unspeakable. The headlines come from all over the place. Do we have that other from around the world thing, too? Yeah, this is just some of the headlines that run from around the world. That guy is still on the large, I guess, and everybody, or at large, and everybody in God's green earth, certainly in Europe, has got his face plastered. The likelihood is that he is back in Syria. So there's just some of the kind of attention that's been brought in Europe. CBS has this story, and then our guest will join us.
Thousands across Paris shared an emotional moment of silence today. They're honoring the lives of the 129 people killed and hundreds more injured in Friday night's terror attacks.
We have to take care and to be careful. Sorry.
French police are moving aggressively, arresting about 24 people overnight during more than 150 raids across the country. Security forces in Belgium are also on the move, searching for 26-year-old Salah Abdeslam. Police say he's the only attacker who escaped. French reports say Abdelhamid Aboud is the mastermind of the operation. He's a Belgian citizen who had gone to fight in Syria, where he's believed to be now. French warplanes slammed targets in Syria overnight, hitting a jihadi training camp and a munitions dump in Raqqa. U.S. intelligence is helping the French locate targets. France is under a state of emergency that could last for the next 3 months.
Marc Genest is from the U.S. Naval War College. Thanks for coming back. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.
I mentioned to Mark, he only comes when there's problems, when there's terror in the world. I mean, your expertise on this is important. What's your overall take right now?
That we have consistently underestimated the Islamic State, particularly this administration. Before I go on, all my comments are my own. They do not represent the Department of Defense or the United States Navy. But the administration has consistently underestimated the agility, the creativity, the ruthlessness, and ISIS's ability to carry out sophisticated operations outside of the region. This is not the first time that this has happened.
Well, the president called him the JV when he was running for re-election, and he seemingly has not been able to get off his heels on that one. I mean, people have been pushing back, and even today he was asked in a press conference, I don't have the video for you, but it was put to him pretty hard, and he seemed pretty aggravated by the questions. Oh, well, it's an aggravating time.
Well, I think it's even more unfortunate that 2 days before the attack, he's talking about successfully containing the Islamic State. Now, he might have meant in Syria itself or in Iraq, but even that is problematic. Since ISIS has really become a force, it has spread not just to Syria, but to Afghanistan, to Yemen, to North Africa, a whole series of places. And its influence among certain segments of European society is growing dramatically, as we've seen. So this is hardly an enemy that's been contained. It's been a failed policy, and I think the administration has to step up and be truthful with the American people, tell them what the real threat is, and then devise a strategy to combat that threat.
He today doubled, tripled, quadrupled down on the idea that the strategy that he has in the long run will be effective and will work. He doesn't seem to be moved by much of what you're saying, or perhaps what a lot of his advisors are telling him. Do you think there's a rift there, or are there inside military and diplomatic personnel who are telling him, hey, we are on the right course? How strong do you think his circle is in staying with the plan that he has?
I think you have to separate the civilian inner circle from the military inner circle. I think in the civilian side, you have a lot of people in the administration, like Susan Rice, for example, who are arguing that, look, military options didn't work so well in Afghanistan and Iraq. Therefore, doubling down again is unlikely to achieve that aim. But in military circles, increasingly you're hearing, look, we have to send sizable numbers of troops there. And sending 50 special operators, they are incredibly talented individuals, brave, skilled, but 50 people cannot defeat a movement like ISIS.
I think his suggestion is, and I think I heard him say today, look, you come in and our military being the best in the world, we'll get them, we'll contain them, we'll stamp them out in the place that they're in right now. Heck, the Kurds had some growth, right, in gaining back some territory in the last couple of weeks. But unless and until the politics of the region are such that there's a sustainability for what we do militarily, then it's not worth doing what we do militarily. That seems to be his thing.
Well, I'd go beyond that. I'd say, look, the narrative constructed by candidate Obama in 2008 and reinforced in 2012 was he is the candidate, he's going to be the president who gets us out of wars. And that's his basic narrative. So when reality is counter to that narrative, he has a difficult time then surmounting that problem and adapting to the changes in the international environment. So as much as everyone would like to be out of Afghanistan, out of Iraq, and have peace throughout the world, that's just a fantasy world. You have to deal with reality. And the reality is the threat of ISIS grew because we withdrew precipitously American forces from Iraq. That created a political vacuum that ISIS filled. And now that they have filled that vacuum, they have continued to grow and become more of an influence regionally and more of a threat globally. If you are going to continue with the original narrative that I'm a president for peace and ignore the reality of the international environment, then you are bringing the United States to an even more dangerous environment and a dangerous situation in which attacks on the homeland become more likely, not less likely.
Do you go all the way back? Because I can hear some of my viewers thinking right now, all right, you're going to whack Obama on this, but it's George W. Bush that put us in this position with his Iraq policies and the second war. This president has been on a political, opposition mode, so withdrawals, dramatic withdrawals. So, okay, he creates the vacuum. How far back do you want to go in terms of attribution of blame for this whole situation?
Well, I think it's perfectly justifiable to say that the Bush administration underestimated the insurgency that would grow in Iraq after our initial invasion of Iraq. So there's plenty of blame to go, bipartisan blame. The problem is, if you've been president for 6 years, over 6 years now, it's time to stop blaming the previous president and come to terms with the failings of your administration's strategy.
All right, when we come back, there's a different tone from the presidents in France and the presidents here. We'll talk about that when we come back. Stay with us.
La France est en guerre.
France is at war.
Speaking to a rare joint session of Parliament, French President François Hollande promised to destroy the ISIS threat following Friday night's deadly attack in Paris.
Now, he hasn't been too popular in his own country for a while. From the winter and Charlie Hebdo and this, whenever the people are looking for you to stand up, it's a time for you to gain some traction. Obviously, this is not the opportunity he was looking for if he's a reasonable human being, and I guess he is. But he's talking about war, and our president's talking about a setback.
Well, because it's happened to
jive?
France. Remember,
Right.
This is, you had Charlie Hebdo, you had what happened this weekend, and you also had the train attack where the Americans intervened
Right.
in France. And
reportedly, the same guy that was with the train attack may have been engaged in this situation.
Yes, and they foiled
How is he
6
still on
other
the street,
plots.
in Belgium?
Right. So they foiled 6 other plots this year alone. So France, because it has a large Muslim population, anywhere between 7 and 10% of the population. So we're talking about 6.5 million Muslims living in France. If you say only 1 or 2% are radical jihadists, you're talking about a sizable number of people who are willing to commit these kind of heinous, violent acts. And unless you do something to stop that, this problem is going to continue to grow because the population in France.
So when the president of France says we're going to get these guys, we're going to end this, is he just bloviating?
No, I think the French Special Forces, we've worked with them for many years, are some of the best in the world. They're tough, and they do what's necessary to accomplish the mission. So if France continues to not waver and commit the kind of resources to it that Hollande says he is, then I think they could make a difference. The key here is to create a grand coalition. The French, the British, the Germans, the Europeans, together with the Americans, together with Turkey, the Iraqis, and the Gulf states, all have the wherewithal to defeat ISIS if we have a coordinated effort that's sound and resourced well.
Turkey's had a real wishy-washy last couple of years, haven't they?
Well, they have, because Erdogan has been consolidating his power in Turkey and trying to create an Islamic state that is a bridge between Islam and the West. And he has been ruthless in his pursuit of power, but he's been fairly effective too. So he has to be very careful because the ISIS is a Sunni organization. Turkey is a Sunni country. So the Turks see the Shia as the primary adversary,
Iran.
not the Sunnis.
Iran.
Right, Iran and also Assad. Assad is an offshoot, an Alawi,
And
offshoot Shia.
isn't he the elephant in the room right now, Assad?
Absolutely. And this is what's separating the Russians from the Americans and the Iranians from the Americans, and that the Iran and Russia are supporting Assad, and the United States, the Gulf states, and Turkey oppose Assad.
Yet this ISIS organization seems to be somewhat erratic and indiscriminate about who it is they go after. If in fact they're responsible for taking down an airline, a Russian airline, if in fact they're responsible for this, and obviously they are, they seem to be playing both ends to the wrong middle if both ends react in some kind of cohesive and consistent fashion, correct?
Not if you follow their strategy. Their strategy is to bring the war home to those nations that attack them, that try to prevent them from expanding. So it's a tit for tat. And they are doing it precisely what other terrorist organizations have done and what Al Qaeda did with the United States. If you are going to play a role in the Middle East, there's going to be a price to be paid. So that's one set of logic. The other logic is kind of a convoluted logic. This is an apocalyptic movement that sees an inevitable clash between Islam and the rest of the world, with Islam inevitably winning. Therefore, the more they do to entice the West to become directly involved, the more that fits their narrative and their long-term strategy.
You see some similar trends to the 1930s in Hitler, correct?
Well, I see, again, the Islamic State is not a powerful actor like Germany is, but it has the potential and has different tactics than the Nazis did to use terrorism to achieve their aims. What the similarity is, in the 1930s, people didn't take Hitler outside of Germany seriously enough. You know, we had the Charlie Chaplin movies mocking him, making fun of him,
Right.
because we couldn't really believe someone that ridiculous would come to power and try to accomplish the task that he did. I think right now we are vastly underestimating ISIS, and we are vastly underestimating their will to do what they want to accomplish.
All right, when we come back, what happens here? Stay with us.
ISIL is the face of evil. Our goal, as I've said many times, is to degrade and ultimately destroy this barbaric terrorist organization.
All right, so that doesn't sound like somebody who's underestimating the organization.
Well, if his goal is to degrade and defeat, then you have to put the resources into degrading and defeating. And if you're going to have what I call immaculate intervention, it's a phrase coined in the 1990s in Bosnia, where the United States is only going to use air power to defeat essentially a ground power, then you have to realize that there's gross limitations to that. You cannot defeat an enemy from the air alone. And until the administration realizes that and is willing to pay the price, you're not going to defeat or degrade the Islamic State.
What about this notion that you can't bomb an idea either? So what is the real potential? If this president, the next president, did all that you think ought to be done in order to accomplish the task, define the task. Is it taking out this organization, or is it taking out an ideology that will just keep replicating itself over and over and over again, permeating young people in the Muslim world who think that everything that the West is representing is just wrong? Is there ever a stop to the psychology of this?
That's a great question. One of the things that you do, the two aren't mutually exclusive. You have to defeat them militarily, and then that allows you to defeat them politically. Right now, there is a perception that the Islamic State is invincible, that it is now increased in size, it's increased in its scope of attacks and the sophistication of its attacks. So first thing you can do to attack their narrative is to attack the reality on the ground, to have tangible defeats, operational defeats of ISIS in areas they not control, like
Getting
Raqqa.
Jihadi John, for example, is that a propaganda win?
It's nice. That's a great thing. Bad, evil man has been killed. That's good. But you have to take and go to their capital, which is a symbolic thing. So if you can go and defeat ISIS in its capital, then you are sending a message, they're not invincible. Look, we can take them out. So the more we do that, and the more land we take back, because the Islamic State is a very different type of terrorist organization. It's a terrorist organization in which there's a there there. They hold territory. If you take back that territory, that disrupts the narrative.
What are the Al-Qaeda guys thinking?
I always compare the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda to Sweeps Week for television, where during that week everybody puts out their best shows and they do the most outrageous things to attract an audience, right? Well, think about this in terms of a long-term Sweeps Week. Terrorist organizations compete for what? To capture the eye of the public. How do you do that? By committing terrorist acts. How do you beat 9/11? You beat 9/11 only by being even more ruthless, even more evil and dramatic, by chopping people's heads off and doing all kinds of heinous acts. Therefore, people are going to turn the station from Al-Qaeda to the Islamic State.
Al-Qaeda frustrated right now?
I believe it is, and it really worries me. It keeps me up at night, because if I am going to compete with the Islamic State and I'm Al-Qaeda, I have to outdo them in their horrific acts.
Is it in their psychology to be limitless in their evil behavior?
Well, there's evidence in the last 2 or 3 years that there was a backlash against Al-Qaeda because they were killing so many Muslims. And Zawahiri, the leader after bin Laden was killed, has said and criticized Islamic State, and that's one of the reasons there's a schism between the two, for killing Muslims. It's going to be interesting. Either the Islamic State is going to become the more moderate terrorist organization, or it's going to have to compete.
What are we going to do with refugees? What are we going to do?
That's a really difficult question. It seems to me that you have to find a middle ground, which is allow refugees to come into the country, but do so very carefully, very slowly. Put a preference for women and children. One of the things that concerns me is that 77% of the refugees are young males. Now, the answer to that is they're probably fleeing Assad because they don't want to join the army, but they are the ones most likely to end up perpetrating acts like Paris.
How worried are you about the mainland? We only have a minute.
Very worried. All you need are 1 or 2 people who know what they're doing. And people who are going back, we have 100 Americans who have gone to Syria or Iraq to fight with the Islamic State.
We chasing them? Do we know who they are?
Well, that's the problem. And we're losing track out of them, because if you go to Turkey, you can then go into Iraq or Syria illegally. So that's one of the problems. It'll come back to haunt us. It's inevitable.
Inevitable.
Yeah. Terrorism is an inevitable reality of the 21st century. All we can do is hope to contain it, and that means using our intelligence sources, using the NSA and eavesdropping mechanisms that we use. We have to understand that we're going to have to sacrifice some of our civil liberties, not all of them, but some of them, to protect the national security of the United States.
You bullish on us recovering from this, or is this going to be one hell of a moment here?
This is a multi-generational conflict. This is going to be the way of life.
Get used to it.
Get used to it.
Wish you had better news.
Me too.
But I appreciate your expertise, Professor Marc Genest. And then there was the other loss. Be right back.